Nina had always considered herself a cautious person, not paranoid, but aware. She was the kind of woman who looked over her shoulder on quiet streets, who never left her drink unattended at a party, who always told a friend where she was going and when she expected to be home. At 26, she was juggling a new city, a demanding grad school program, and the slow, uncertain process of trying to rebuild a social life after moving across the country. So when she matched with Lucas on Hinge, she hesitated for 2 whole days before replying. He seemed safe, on the surface. He worked remotely, was visiting Seattle to scout locations for a project, and had a golden retriever named Jazz who made frequent appearances in his photos. His messages were thoughtful, not overbearing. He asked questions. He didn't push. He seemed like someone who understood boundaries, who respected the pace of connection. When he asked if she'd like to meet up while he was in town, she said yes, still cautious, but willing. They agreed on something low pressure. Instead of a crowded bar or busy restaurant, they'd cook dinner together at the Airbnb he was renting near downtown. Nina hesitated. Meeting at someone's place on a first date? It felt risky. But then again, it was a shared space, a corporate-style building with front desk staff, security cameras, and a key code entry. Lucas offered to cook. He said he'd bring wine. He even asked what kind of music she liked. She told herself it wasn't any more dangerous than having dinner at a friend's apartment. When she arrived, the place looked exactly like the pictures, clean, modern, impersonal. Lucas greeted her with a warm smile and a playlist of 90s R&B playing softly in the background. He had already opened the wine and was sautéing garlic in a skillet when she walked in. The air smelled good. He was charming, but not too smooth. Just enough stumbles in his speech to feel real. They talked about music, travel, their mutual love for dogs. Nina started to relax. It wasn't until halfway through dinner that something shifted. Lucas started talking more quickly, less thoughtfully. He veered into stories about his ex-girlfriend, how she ghosted him after 2 years, how women always leave. How he never understood why people could just walk away from someone who loved them. He laughed when he said it, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. There was a tightness around his mouth, something unprocessed lurking beneath his words. Nina felt her stomach clench, like a warning bell quietly ringing. Still, she stayed calm. Smiled. Changed the subject. They moved to the couch after dinner, and she politely declined a second glass of wine. Lucas leaned back and sighed. "You know," he said, staring at the ceiling, "I really feel like we connected tonight. I don't meet people like this often. I think I'm gonna sleep here." Nina blinked. "You mean stay here?" she asked, her voice light but firm. He turned toward her, his tone shifting. "Yeah. You seem comfortable. We're adults. Why not?" She laughed softly. "That's flattering, but I think I'm gonna head out soon." Lucas didn't move. He just stared at her, a strange tension in his body. "You don't trust me?" The air grew heavier. Nina's heart rate picked up. She smiled again, softer this time. "It's not about trust. I just don't sleep over on first dates." She stood up, feigning a stretch. "I'm going to grab another blanket. Getting chilly in here." She walked slowly toward the bedroom, her mind racing. Once out of sight, she pulled out her phone and texted her roommate a single red flag emoji along with the address. They had a code. If anyone ever sent that emoji alone, it meant call me immediately and stay on the line. Then she called the front desk downstairs, pretending to be a hotel guest with a noise complaint. "There's a man in the unit next to me who's acting aggressive. Can someone come check it out?" The response was swift. Within 10 minutes, there was a knock on the door. Lucas opened it, clearly surprised. 2 security personnel stood outside. "Sir, we received a disturbance call. Everything okay here?" Lucas tried to downplay it, but Nina walked up behind him, her voice calm. "I think I'm ready to call it a night." The security team didn't press. They simply waited as Lucas stepped back, letting her through. He didn't say goodbye. Outside, the night air felt like freedom. Nina got into her rideshare and didn't speak a word until she reached home. When she finally closed the door to her apartment behind her, she leaned against it and shook. Not out of panic, but from the adrenaline. The shock of how quickly something safe had become dangerous. The shock of how easily someone could push past her boundaries, even with a smile. The next day, she deleted his number. Reported his profile. Then she sat with her roommates and created something they called the first date buddy system. It wasn't just about texting your location anymore. They made a calendar, set check-in times, and agreed on shared signals. If anyone was going on a date, especially a first date, someone else would be on call. Not out of fear, but out of care. Out of the understanding that modern dating, for all its excitement, still required modern safety measures, Nina didn't stop dating. She didn't build walls. But she did rebuild something else, her trust in herself. The moment she walked away from that couch, from that tension, from the subtle emotional pressure, she rewrote the story. It didn't end in crisis. It ended in strength. In clarity. In listening to her gut and choosing peace over politeness. Years later, when asked about it by a friend, she said something simple: "He didn't try to hurt me. But he didn't try to make me feel safe either. And that's enough for me to walk away." It wasn't a horror story after all. It was a story of a woman learning that safety doesn't always scream, sometimes, it whispers. And when it does, you'd better be listening. Tyler had never been one for flashy dating profiles. His pictures were simple, one of him on a mountain trail, one holding a coffee cup at his favorite cafe, and one blurry selfie with his dog, Maverick. He wasn't trying to sell a dream, just hoping to find someone genuine. That's what drew him to Maya's profile. Her photos radiated confidence, but it wasn't just about looks. She posted about therapy, growth, breathwork, and cold plunges. There was a raw honesty in the way she described herself. Intensity is not a flaw. It's a filter. He was intrigued, they matched quickly, and their messages were magnetic from the start. Maya had a sharp wit, but also knew how to ask the kinds of questions most people avoided. What scared you as a child? What does vulnerability look like for you now? Tyler found himself opening up more than he usually would. There was a rhythm to their exchange, a feeling like maybe, finally, he'd found someone who didn't fear depth. After a week of long messages and a phone call that stretched past midnight, she suggested a first date. But not just any first date, something, in her words, transformational. She invited him to join her at a wellness center on the edge of Denver, where they could start their day with a cold plunge, a freezing tub of water meant to shock the system, strengthen resilience, and build trust through discomfort. Afterwards, they could grab smoothies and walk through the nearby park. Tyler hesitated. It wasn't the idea of the cold plunge, he'd done one before during a hiking retreat, but something about the intensity of it, the framing of the date as a kind of emotional test, gave him pause. Still, curiosity won out. He admired her commitment to authenticity. Maybe, he thought, stepping outside of the usual dinner and drinks formula would lead to something more meaningful. That Saturday morning, he pulled into the wellness center parking lot, dressed in gym shorts and a hoodie, trying to quiet the swirl of nerves in his stomach. Maya was already there, waving him over with a bright, electric energy. She looked just like her photos, maybe even more striking in person, but it wasn't her appearance that caught him off guard. It was the phone in her hand, angled toward them like a casual selfie cam. "You don't mind if I film a little?" she said quickly. "I'm doing a challenge for my channel, 30 days of pushing past fear. You're cool with being part of it, right?" Tyler blinked. The question felt more like a statement. She had already pressed record. He forced a small smile. I guess, yeah. Just don't put me in anything too embarrassing. She laughed and waved it off. Of course. You'll look great. Vulnerability is beautiful. The words were well-intentioned, but something in his gut shifted. Still, he followed her inside, greeted the staff, and made his way to the cold plunge area. The water was brutal, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, crisp enough to steal your breath. Maya jumped in first, letting out a scream laugh, and then motioned for Tyler to follow. As he stepped in, the shock hit his body like a jolt of electricity, and for a moment, all he could focus on was staying in, but Maya wasn't just focused on the moment. She was talking to the camera now. Narrating the experience, analyzing Tyler's responses like a coach breaking down a game. See how he tenses his shoulders? She said to the lens. That's resistance. But he's trying. Tyler's face flushed, not from the cold, but from the sudden awareness that he wasn't a participant, he was content. They stayed in the tub for just under 3 minutes. When they stepped out, wrapped in towels and catching their breath, Maya pointed toward a bench where she'd set up a second tripod. Let's do a quick post-plunge check-in, she said brightly. Talk about how you feel. You can be as real as you want. Tyler declined. I think I'll sit this one out. Kinda wiped, he said, trying to keep it light. She looked surprised, but nodded. Sure. Your call. They walked to the smoothie bar in silence. Maya chatted about her plans for future videos, how she wanted to inspire people to live more boldly, how she believed everyone needed to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Tyler listened. But the dissonance was growing louder inside him. The woman he'd shared late-night conversations with, the one who asked about his childhood fears, suddenly felt far away. By the time they said goodbye, Maya had returned to vlogging mode, thanking her followers and teasing the next day's plunge partner. Tyler stood off to the side, unsure of what part he had played in her story. He drove home with a knot in his chest, the feeling of being seen, but not known. Captured, but not respected. Later that night, a friend sent him a message. Hey, is this you? It was a link to Maya's new video. The title read, Why Some Men Aren't Built for Real Intimacy. The thumbnail was a still of Tyler stepping into the ice bath. Grimacing. The video wasn't cruel, but it was deeply personal. Maya spoke about emotional avoidance, about her frustration with men who shut down when challenged, and how growth required radical transparency. Tyler felt betrayed. He hadn't signed up to be a symbol. He reported the video. It was eventually taken down. But the damage lingered longer than the footage. He spent days replaying the experience, not just out of anger, but confusion. Was he overreacting? Had he missed some social cue, failed some emotional test? The questions kept circling, until one night, sitting alone with his journal, he wrote a single sentence: I'm allowed to choose what I share, and with whom. That became a mantra. A reset. In the weeks that followed, Tyler started writing more, not just journaling, but essays, small reflections he posted anonymously on forums and later, under his name, on a blog he titled Modern Boundaries. It wasn't about shaming Maya or dissecting that day. It was about exploring how men, too, navigate consent, privacy, vulnerability. How the pressure to be emotionally available sometimes comes wrapped in performance and expectation. The experience hadn't broken him. It had clarified him. He didn't retreat from dating, but he did begin showing up with clearer language. When someone asked to share a moment, he asked what that meant. When someone offered connection, he asked whether they saw him, or just the idea of him. In time, Tyler's story became more than just a strange date. It became a turning point, not just for him, but for others who read his words and finally felt seen. Because sometimes, the most uncomfortable part of a cold plunge isn't the water, it's realizing who's really holding the camera. Rachel wasn't new to dating. At 35, she had been through enough to know the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between charm and character. After her divorce 3 years earlier, she had taken her time to rebuild, piece by piece, not just her routine or her finances, but her sense of self. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't jaded. But she was careful. Dating, for her, had become less about finding the one and more about finding someone who felt like peace, not pressure. So when Derek messaged her on a Thursday afternoon through a dating app, she didn't expect much. His profile was straightforward, no flashy bios or poetic quotes. He described himself as a freelance photographer who loved capturing the unnoticed moments. His pictures were relaxed, mostly candid shots of him on city sidewalks, holding an old camera, smiling with friends. There was something grounded about him. They chatted for a couple of days, light banter at first, then longer exchanges about books they were reading, their favorite neighborhoods in Austin, and how exhausting small talk could be. Derek had a way of listening without filling the silence. He wasn't overly flirtatious, but he asked thoughtful questions. When he suggested meeting for coffee on a Sunday afternoon, Rachel agreed. The cafe they chose was sunlit and quiet, tucked into a residential corner of the city. Derek was already there when she arrived, sitting outside with 2 coffees and a folded newspaper. He stood when he saw her, smiling, not the kind of smile that tries to impress, but the kind that simply says, "I'm glad you're here." They talked easily. The conversation flowed in that rare way that feels both effortless and meaningful. After finishing their drinks, they walked downtown, letting the conversation expand as they wandered through side streets and paused at murals and bookstores. It had been a while since Rachel felt that present with someone. A little over 2 hours in, the tone shifted, not in a bad way, but with an added layer of intimacy. Derek told her about his father's sudden passing the year before. He spoke with a mixture of pain and clarity, and Rachel listened, feeling honored by his openness. She shared something of her own, a time in her early 20s when she'd lost direction and had to rebuild from scratch. There was no awkwardness in the exchange, just 2 people acknowledging that life hadn't always been easy, but that they'd grown from it. As the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, Derek turned to her and said, almost gently, "You're the kind of person who doesn't just fill space. You deepen it. That's rare." Rachel felt her chest warm. It was the kind of compliment that bypasses ego and goes straight to the soul. Then he said something else. "I've got wine back at my place. A rooftop view you'd love. Want to keep this going?" He asked it kindly, without pressure, but still, there it was. Rachel paused. Everything about the afternoon had felt safe, natural, human. There were no red flags. No pushiness. No warning bells. And yet, something deep inside her stirred. Not fear, exactly. Just a quiet, unmistakable hesitation. She looked at Derek. She saw his sincerity, his openness. And still, she said, "I think I'll call it a day." There was a flicker in his eyes, surprise, maybe a bit of disappointment, but he didn't argue. He nodded, then smiled softly. "Of course. No pressure." They hugged goodbye, and she walked away feeling calm, not conflicted. There was no drama. No confrontation. Just a decision made in alignment with something deeper than logic, something intuitive, unspoken. That night, as she settled into bed, Rachel replayed the date in her head. She didn't regret a moment of it. But she was proud of herself for listening to the small voice within that told her, gently but clearly, "This is enough for now." The next morning, while scrolling through Instagram, she got a message from a close friend who also lived in Austin. "Hey. This might be nothing, but isn't this the guy you went out with yesterday?" Attached was a screenshot from a local true crime podcast's episode summary. Rachel's heart slowed. The podcast was one of those semi-popular regional shows, a mix of survivor interviews and crowdsourced cautionary tales. The episode in question was titled Charming at First, Dating Stories That Took a Turn. A woman described her relationship with a photographer in Austin named Derek, same age, same build, same profession. The woman shared how the relationship started beautifully, even soulfully, but over time turned emotionally manipulative. He had pressured her into sharing private photos, then threatened to leak them when she tried to leave. There were patterns of possessiveness, control masked as deep affection, and persistent boundary pushing disguised as passion. Rachel sat with the information. Her breath was steady, but her mind raced. She looked back at Derek's profile, now deactivated. She checked their message thread. Gone. She felt a chill, not the kind that makes you afraid, but the kind that confirms what you already knew but couldn't name. That her no, given without explanation or justification, had been the right one. That her pause wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom. Later that week, Rachel started something new. Not out of fear, but out of reverence for her intuition. After every date, she'd write, not a review of the other person, but a reflection of how she felt. Not whether they were interesting or attractive or emotionally available, but how she felt around them. Did she feel expansive or small? Open or guarded? Seen or assessed? She called it her intuition journal. And over time, it became more than a ritual, it became a guide. A reminder that she didn't need a dramatic reason to walk away. That peace, not panic, was the most powerful indicator of alignment. Rachel never spoke to Derek again. She didn't need to. The lesson wasn't about him. It was about listening when there's nothing loud to hear. Trusting the quiet no. Honoring the pause, because not every horror story has a scream. Sometimes, the scariest thing is how normal it all seems, until it's not. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is say no before the story writes itself without you. She never saw that date as a mistake. She saw it as a moment of remembering her own authority. A moment when, without knowing the whole truth, she trusted herself anyway, and that, she thought later, sipping coffee alone on another Sunday, is the kind of love story worth telling. The one where you save yourself. Stories like Rachel's remind us that courage doesn't always roar, it often whispers. The strength to say no, to walk away without explanation, and to trust your inner knowing is a form of self-love that can protect you from pain you may never see coming. The greatest lesson here isn't about fear, it's about intuition, awareness, and honoring your emotional safety above all else. In a world that often rewards politeness over self-protection, listening to your gut is a radical act of empowerment. Let this be your reminder: you don't need proof to set a boundary. You don't need drama to justify your decision. Sometimes, saving yourself happens quietly, and that's powerful. If this story resonated with you, inspired you, or made you reflect, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the energy and motivation to keep creating meaningful, honest content that helps others feel seen, safe, and strong.